Student Success, Built by Design, expanding the human potential for today's students. Welcome to Student Success, Built by Design. In this podcast, we explore the fundamental question of how the built environment impacts student success. We will showcase specific design and build achievements of the San Diego Community College District's $3.5 billion bond measure HH, whose goal is to further our education and student success mission by designing and constructing learning environments that don't simply host students, but elevate them, academically, personally, and socially. Therefore, we design with a clear purpose and build with mission. Welcome to our podcast on student success, built by design. Today, we're discussing health and habitability, safety and security. We'll be diving deeper into student success that we discussed in our first episode. We'll be engaging our panel on the first layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, physiological needs of shelter, food, water, and comfort. We'll explore the design of the built environment and how it can impact the student experience in their success. So just wanted to welcome back our guest, Dr. Joel Peterson, San Diego Community College District Vice Chancellor and Executive Operations Officer, Aurora Ayala, San Diego Community College District Associate Vice Chancellor for Facilities, Risk Management, and Operations, Jennifer Gibb, Van Pelt Construction Services Vice President, Business Development, and Andrea Stalker, PBK Architects, Principal and Director of Higher Education, and myself, Jeff Johnson, PBK Architects, Principal and Director of Design and Educational Planning. So in our first episode, we were talking about defining student success, and we were talking about personal element where students' own wellness and their connection to their educational study, and social, starting to realize that education is an interactive and community-based where students are working together, and also professional, that understanding their studies of a vocation that they're going into and the impact that that has on the community itself. And so with today, we wanted to talk a little bit more in detail about that first layer. So health and habitability, safety and security. So today we want to get into a little bit more better understanding, defining what that is and its relationship to the built environment and what that means for the next steps or for projects for the Measure HH. So first, Dr. Peterson, what are your initial thoughts on health and habitability and safety and security? And how does that relate to our previous discussion on student success?
Thanks, Jeff. This is a fascinating part of designing and constructing. As we talked about, that student success is built upon a foundation of meeting the underlying human needs that must be met, or to the extent that we don't meet them, that can get in the way of student success. And at the very basic level is just the most physiologically necessary components. We all must breathe. We need air, and we need clean air. We need to have water and food. We need to have shelter. And those things get brought into the very basic level of design. You and Andrea, who can speak much more to that, but also then on the maintainability of it. And then the layer above that comes into the safety and security. What do we do to make sure that buildings are secure, that people can only get into the places that they should get into? They don't accidentally get into mechanical spaces or potentially to unsecured spaces. So I think this is going to be a fascinating discussion that we're going to have today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the thoughts of other people.
Aurora, what are some of your thoughts?
Gosh, I'm trying not to have too much of a facilities mindset, but I can't help it. When I'm thinking of safe space for our students, I I think of hidden hallways. I think of lights. I think of furniture, the placement. I think of accessibility to their from their car to their classroom and the proper lighting, the slope in our pathways for some of our students that have mobility limitations. I go there for safety.
So how does that relate to San Diego Community College and, relating to safe and healthy facilities?
Uh, I hope it doesn't sound like it's fake, but it's literally the foundation of everything that we do. I mean, from the interview of the architects that we want to select, that is literally what our chancellor looks like. How will you think of the design when you're thinking of design? Like, how do you incorporate safety? And by that is minimizing hidden spots by proper proper lighting, minimize having to install cameras by how you place the common areas that there can be line of sight. When we're looking at where we place trees, is it when they're fully grown, are they going to obstruct lighting? Do we put bollard lightings? Do we put wall stanchions? Just like everything that we think about from the beginning of a program, we're thinking of the safety of the students.
One of the key things is that we have, for instance, in all of our programming and design meetings and discussions with all the final stakeholder groups, but included in that, we have a dedicated police lieutenant from our police department that is focused just on the bonds. And so he attends all these meetings and looks at it through this sort of a safety and security lens. And so, and in fact, Aurora, probably being modest here, but she spearheaded the whole concept that we want to incorporate into our bond program a specific study focused on illumination so that we can look at interior and exterior illumination initially from a code compliance, but then beyond that to what would be the best practices to enhance safety. And then lastly, what would be the best things to enhance the perception of safety? Because we all know that, you can make something that the engineers all say is very safe, but different people have different perceptions and different kinds of experiences. So that's an initiative that Aurora suggested and that we have incorporated into our bond program.
And that's great. How have you seen some of the impacts or effects from the student experience? Have you seen differences where lighting or certain elements like you're talking about?
I can think of a recent example. Now with our Measure H8, we're able to do some pretty aggressive and simple changes. We recently had one of our community colleges where we had people that were homeless coming into the campus, and it was a very hidden area, very dark. It was hard to regulate. And we did a simple fix with the fencing. But what we also did is we put motion sensor lighting. And so now the students knew that in our police department, if there's a light on, someone's there. But it also gave our students now a safe place where they can go. And this was a part of a landscape project that they can now know that they can go safely and be planting it's an agriculture area without running the risk of running into someone. So it's a simple thing, but the motion sensor lighting provided safety not only to our students but our police. Like they now know that there's someone there.
So that the idea of perception, sometimes, like you say, that they're really simple. Um, Jennifer, so what are some of the best practices that we've seen, like kind of in a construction unit? We talked about fencing that relate to safety and security on the campus.
I think that understanding the needs, like Aurora and Dr. Peterson were stating, and then making sure that we can actually build it right from a safety perspective. And so, how do people feel safe? And then, are we going to be able to actually build it? Is it going to be maintainable? And I know I'm kind of like, yes, from safety standpoint, from the construction side, it's like it can be designed really well. Andrea and Jeff, you guys can design it really great. We can think that it's going to work, but then can we build it? Can we afford to build it? Can we afford to maintain it? Can we will it meet the schedule? All of those kinds of things from the construction standpoint, I think are important to think about. And so what we're going through that process with our design team and the stakeholders is really understanding, like Aurora was saying, is this going to be the best process, the best solution? What do we currently have? Are we reviewing that? Because what was put in place wasn't, it was at the time the best at that time, right? And now we're upgrading it. We're getting a new process in place, and maybe there's updated standards. And so going through that and making sure that we're thoughtful about it is really important, because it's not necessarily hey, this is safe. How does it make the user feel? Does the user really truly feel safe? Like Aurora was saying, when they have that lighted pathway, can I get back to my car after class and feel safe getting home? That's really important.
Jennifer, your comments remind me of actual incident that I had at a higher ed institution where the designers had designed for the main stairway for the 3-story computer science building that we were building and designing. And during the whole sort of buildability study and looking at materiality and what we could do for value engineering, the construction company was the one that kind of pointed this out, that you had a steel staircase that was going to be then tied to a handrail that was going to be aluminum, and that the washer that they were putting in between the two was inadequate, that they had a polymer washer, but it really needed to be a much more robust kind of a rubberized base. Otherwise, we were going to be looking at bimetallic corrosion that would start very quickly. And then you would have that situation where the handrail would become unstable within just a year or two. And that was an example of sort of a core safety thing that was dependent on literally the nuts and bolts of the design and the specifications. One thing I know that, Andrea, you specialize in sort of equitable design on a lot of fronts, and maybe we could turn back a little bit. I know that during the pandemic, there was a lot of focus on environmental health and literally the air quality, and as well as other kind of components that very basic in the water and how we surfaces that we have. And I know a lot of technologies seem to come out, some that I think seem to have maybe gone by the wayside, but maybe you can speak to the evolving nature at this very basic level, even before we talk about more on safety and security.
Sure, absolutely. And to preface it by saying I'm not a mechanical engineer, so the architect's version of this, but I think one of the things that we saw stick coming out of the pandemic was really the HEPA filtration for the air handling systems, right? And just understanding that at these higher level of filtrations, we're just getting cleaner, better air, and that there's sort of a sweet spot with the cost about what is too far and dialing that back, but enhanced from what we would have done pre-pandemic, and that there's value in having those conversations early on and really do creating clean, healthy interior environments. And much as sustainability and LEED has been looking at doing for many years now, but having that indoor air quality at that highest level that we can within the cost constraints of the project. And so I think that's one of the ones that stuck. I think there's a lot of other technology that had to do, like UV this or some of that sort of stuff that we've really seen kind of go by the wayside. That I think was one of those fads. It's, you tried it, everyone was like, okay, well, that wasn't appropriate. And now we've kind of landed on these ones that we hope will be integrated into all
Yeah,
projects in
I
the
remember
future.
they had what was that, the ionization kind of things, and that was a lot of controversy on whether that actually made any sense. But some of this technology adds challenges on the maintenance side because when you have the HEPA filters, then maybe Aurora, you have some experience in this.
Literally, as Andrea was talking about the HEPA filters, I'm like, oh gosh, don't promote it because it is a challenge. I mean, it's fantastic. It gives you that sense that you have not, good clean air. But now facilities has to replace those filters along with the filters that we already have to replace on our air handlers. And as we know in public works, sometimes we don't have the human resources that we need to maintain the facilities that we have. So adding that additional layer just adds additional cost and that we just can't keep up with.
And that is why it's so important to have these conversations early on in the design process, really as part of a larger like life cycle cost analysis. Because as much as we want to provide these clean, healthy environments, if down the road you can't maintain it and it leads to a dirtier environment in the long run, then we need to design those systems up front, right? To
What
align with your needs.
one of the features of design that I found that I prefer is natural ventilation that has a sensor that turns off the HVAC system, so we don't have redundancy. But then you need to have a controlled area, whether it's a classroom or it's an office, which is an upfront construction cost, but not a long-term maintenance cost.
This was a great discussion. That my brother's a doctor and works for CDC. So when COVID came out, it's like we ended up presenting together. Like I would thought never that we would, as a doctor and architect, but the idea of like how do we redesign thinking of healthcare, and to this point, like the air filtration and what gets into the air or stopping it from that. But then there's other things like the surfaces and even certain textures and certain materials are 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 better and worse. So to that point, Andrea, as we design spaces, what other areas of design that do we need to really look at it as far as protective, safe
So if I
environments?
could jump in on because we're actually dealing with something right now as part of our Measure HH program. One of the projects is a HVAC upgrade for our one of our gymnasiums and at City College. And in the original design and what was constructed, I can almost guess what happened. So there is no air conditioning in this gymnasium. Plenty of ventilation, lots of airflow. CFM is through the roof, literally. But what happened is that we're having all sorts of condensation. We've been having this for decades, where you get condensation on the gym floor. It becomes very slick. So we've got extra fans, and we have to go and have custodians go out there and constantly dry off the gymnasium floor, et cetera. And I can bet what happened is that somebody looked up in the tables on what the climate was quantified as, and San Diego in general is a desert climate. And they probably looked up the wet bulb and the dry bulb temperatures and found that, oh, we don't need to have it conditioned because it's so dry and the dew point is so low, you're not going to have an issue. But the reality is that City College is located within less than a mile of the harbor. And so you get this cool air and it's in a lower kind of position. So it gets this cool, moist air that comes in. And even though the greater area, so I can just bet that's what happened in design. But I just thought I'd share that while Andrea then can discuss further on other kind of design elements.
Well, and I think that's a great example of, as we think of safety in maybe three different ways, and that's not only improving the health of the environment, but also for the physical safety of students, right? And so that's sort of one category. And then that second one being the security or, people's access and crime prevention. And I think it's so great that as a district, your guys' guidelines and standards includes a whole chapter on crime prevention through environmental design, which is a policy that's long been adopted, but you guys have taken a step farther to go through and list very specific measures. And not every district has that. And so to have that as a starting point is fantastic. And I love that in that you included the four key metrics of natural surveillance, natural access control, target hardening, and then my favorite as an architect is territorial management. And this goes to the idea that if you can define a space such that people take ownership of it, they are then more likely in that ownership and sense of community to be aware of like when there's intruders and to notify. But that's a very nebulous thing about how do you say we're going to do that, create a sense of territory and ownership. And I think that's where architecture can play a great role in designing spaces that feel culturally relevant and welcoming and give people a sense of belonging so that they do take that ownership. And in doing that, then we can help with this crime prevention through environmental design.
And Joel, to that point, with those policies that you have that Andrea explained so well, what was behind that policy making, and how do you see that kind of being played out through the projects?
Key part is that we looked at a number of research in this area about what can we do with design and then the materials we use and then how even it's been physically manifested through the construction of it that environment impacts behaviors, kind of an extension of the broken window thing, that so how do we make sure that design promotes certain kinds of behaviors? And our police department, all of our police chief and lieutenants are trained in that sort of environment, helping to reduce, crime components. We looked at studies like there's a famous one done by the Washington D.C. Metro Rail that without doing any change other than to change the environment, the lighting, the kind of benches they had, the kind of shelters, et cetera, they were able to reduce crime rates 40% simply by doing passive environmental change. So, and I would love to get Jennifer's thought on this one. Part of when we talk about how we can construct for our student housing, one of the things that originally the design team had wanted to do was to create surfaces that was going to be unwelcoming for urban camping. And so they were going to get double kind of thing by using the broken concrete from the demoing of the site to then put that into avant-garde rock garden-y looking thing around. It was our builders who said, "Hey, we're gonna have to try to figure out how to stick that in there, and then how they would have to be lodged in so they couldn't be easily reduced because, if they come loose and so forth, and now they become things that can be thrown through windows and things like that." And at the same time, they looked awfully jagged and people might think we were being a little too aggressive in our passive repellent. But I thought it was fantastic that it was actually the builder team that brought that kind of concept up. That it's fine to design it and maybe put it initially, but how do you make sure that you can put it in so that it stays?
Absolutely. I think safety, not only while we're building it, but after the fact, right? People walking over it. Path of travel isn't always what is designed, right? And so even if it's a deterrent um, for unhoused or others to occupy, it might have been a better path of travel per that one student, and then they trip, and now you have a liability that way from a safety standpoint. So stuff like that, thinking we've seen it because it's kind of more on the active job side of it, like all of the challenges we have from design, groundbreaking till when we can occupy. There's a lot of hazards, and so we see them before they even happen sometimes. It's a great idea. I think it's just hard to. We had that situation with um, there were some larger boulders that were in a design that would be really great for kind of similar to what you're saying, Dr. Peterson. It was just a design aspect and ended up not meeting a different code that was being requested from a permitting process. So they were beautiful to look at, but then from a practicality, we couldn't finalize the permitting on this project that I was working on. And so we actually had to remove them. And so, again, it was push, push, push. That thought was the design. And then when they're getting placed, we're like, are you sure? Everybody said, nope, we want them. And then when we went to permit we had to take them out. So it's kind of just that forethought from experience, right? You already saw it happen that one time. So yes, every community is different. Measure HH is different. And we have done this before. Let's not do it again. Is kind of the goal.
Well, that's where creativity can be a good thing, but then depending on how creative, there's a checks and balances. I was wondering with Aurora, some of them were talking about these guidelines and studies. What have you seen the most impact on the student experience? HVAC and lighting and these kind of things.
I think we're pretty fortunate that we established a lot of our guidelines and our standards of design as we knew Measure HH was coming on. So we have a manual now that we use for that we give to our architects. These are our standards. These are the specifications of products that we want you to incorporate into our design, and it goes down to the type of blue light that we want. Uh, the door closures that we want. We don't want doors to be left open. We want our students to know that when a door is closed, it's locked. So there's certain things that we've already we've done the homework to make sure it's incorporated to design. But Dr. Peterson was talking about getting creative with design to keep the guests that we want there and the guests that we don't want there to keep them moving. Um, we've actually put that thought into our landscape specifications, folders where we want them, the type of landscape that we want, and we thinking about sustainability. Some of our native plants, the ones that we want intentionally in design that help keep some of our passing visitors to continue passing. So, I mean, at the end, what we want is our students to know that this is their area, their community. And if there's anyone that's there, it's because they're there for the same purpose, to to take a course, to take advantage of our community college and the community environment that we worked so hard for. Um,
One of the things that we found, not just the safety of our students, but for our staff, and particularly our maintenance staff, is that as part of what we're doing to modernize our facilities through Measure HH is basic safety components, such as we're finding a lot of our roofs don't have tie-off hard points. So when we have to go up and do maintenance, repair the roof, or to do cleaning, getting things out of downspouts, we want to think about our safety staff, our custodians, our maintenance people. And so those are kind of components as well that if you don't design them in, um, we found that out through Aurora's, maintenance and operations teams on where we were missing these things.
yeah.
It just comes to the point that a lot of these things, there's certain things that work and certain things that don't, standards. So it's, evidence-based design. So Andrea, why are these so critical that, we're not testing new things, but we're actually using evidence-based?
Well, I think it's important to understand that there is an evolution that's happening as it comes to particularly where we have security or then the perception of safety and security. And that the more we recognize that different individuals perceive safety and security in different ways, it's important for us to test some of these long-standing policies or procedures. And I think of the idea of natural surveillance, so which would tell us
Mhm.
that quite a lot of transparency and visual sightlines is nothing but good. But I've also talked to some students who say that being in that type of fishbowl environment can feel very unsafe to them because it puts them very much on display, makes them feel watched. For some women students, can make them feel like they could become targeted and followed, and all these things. And so it's for me, it is an evolution and one that we always want to just keep testing what we have been doing, making sure that we're getting input from a wide variety of people, individuals, the perspectives, so that it's safe not just based on what we've done before in the past, but will be safe and secure for the current and future students going forward.
These are great topics. I mean, we're bringing up a lot of important things, and it's great that we're getting them out. I was wondering, Dr. Peterson, how do we kind of prioritize with these concepts, and how do they evolve themselves into the projects that you're working on, and what's critical?
Well, what's wonderful is that these are situations and topics and issues that have been around for millennia. And so we stand on the shoulders of people who stand on the shoulders of the people who stand all the way back. So the building code itself has actually solved much of this for us. So my concern is less about that we're going to miss something that covers clean water and safe environments and clean air and environments that will feel safe and secure and be actually safe and secure. But it comes down to is how we can take what the building code requires of us and do it in a way that then doesn't preclude higher level needs. So, as an example, a prison, I'm sure, has clean water and clean air and is very secure and very safe
Hmm.
in many ways. However, it may dampen creativity and may, limit socialization and a sense of belonging and ownership and a sense of enfranchisement and self-actualization. So the challenge here is how can we make sure that we maximize that physical layer of health and habitability and that second layer of safety and security and not preclude and or minimize other human needs that ultimately are required for our students to become successful.
Are there any particular hurdles, in infusing? You had mentioned like code is actually taking care of a lot of things, but then being creative with the constraints. Are there
So
any?
we did as there's an example that I could point to at our affordable student housing construction that we're doing right now that will be for about 800 students, 284 units that are apartment style. And the front entrance originally was going to be just kind of open and very welcoming, very transparent glass and so forth. One was we made it a two door rather than just a one door into the lobby. And one of the things that we talked about was designing to have a distance enough between the two doors so that somebody couldn't just follow somebody else in, that, that a person could get through one and the other person, but to be enough time and distance that the individual, if they knew they were being followed, had opportunity to get into the other, or way to not go in. And then even before then, we then said, it'd be nice if we had sort of a security gate of some kind, but how do you make it not look like a gate? And the design team came up with a very creative way of having sort of slatted steel, but you know, uh, that were going to be decorative in nature, so that it blended in with the style of the campus, and that it had visibility and stats, so that it didn't look like it was just a wall, but it gave a solid physical barrier that could not be climbed over, because the area that we have does have a significant number of people who are having issues with mental health and housing and so forth. So that's an example of where I got to see firsthand our design team being very creative and responsive to the concerns that the overall team, the end users, as well as our safety and security people, brought forth as potential concerns.
And so, Andrea, as we talk about design and integration and constructability, it, like Joel was talking about, how does it? How do we work these things as they were intended? They don't seem like security, they're just a natural part. How does that work?
Yeah, and I think it's all about achieving the right balance, right? And recognizing what are the goals and what are those higher goals and how do we, as Dr. Peterson said, not construct or design something that's going to minimize those higher goals while still achieving these fundamental physiological and safety and security needs. And I think that's really through iteration and exploration and working collaborative with everyone from very early on, including the district and stakeholders and the builder, as we've learned here, to identify the right washer or how it's going to be attached and all of that. And so it's really by bringing everyone together early on to look at all these things that you arrive at a design solution that meets them. But I do think I you asked what are some of the hurdles that we face, and I always caution us that we don't want to let that hurdle of fear like overcome the end result, right? And sometimes it's easy to be fearful of the active shooter situation or just, all these horrible things that could happen or that we could get lost in that we should absolutely design and prepare for, but not to the extent as Dr. Peterson was saying, like so that we're building a bunker that doesn't then also meet our goals around health and habitability and creativity and socialization and all these other elements. So finding that right balance, always aligned with the district's goals, budget, cost, all those extra things that go along with it. Mhm.
It seems like the collaboration and teamwork, bringing infusing all these things in together and make it seem natural. I was wondering, Jennifer is working through owner and architect, some of the operations and systems or procedures that keeping this collaborative and creative, but then realistic. What are some of those in place that you have?
Yeah, I think that's really key. I think when Andrea was speaking, it's like just being able to pivot. And the main one, it's saying sounds more simple than it needs to be, but it's communication, right?
Mhm.
Constantly working together, meeting, talking through ideas, not being afraid to come to the table with those. Um, again, we're all experts in our own way, and so really the team is bringing forth those experiences and ideas and creative solutions. And so yes, there's different tools that we're using to track and keep and stay collaborative and keep schedule on and budget on and different systems. But I think ultimately it comes down to being open to communicate and remembering why we're here, and it's for the betterment of our community, the students, the safety of our students and our team building, and really being thoughtful about that and the long-term investment that Measure HH and the community can do. So I think, again, coming down to some of the most basic things, just talking.
Jennifer, I'm curious to maybe hear a little bit of your thoughts on, because we're taking it for granted when you say, well, what does the builder do? We're talking a lot about, oh, well, you designed for this, you designed for that. But we're just assuming that what is designed actually gets built. And I had a project at one of my other institutions that I was at where the general contractor ended up in long litigation. And ultimately, decades later, the only people that won were the lawyers. But not to disparage lawyers, but what happened was that they used cheaper materials than what was specified, and only And then any places that could not be easily inspected, they went ahead and actually didn't even build it to the full thing, and didn't have all the bolts or didn't have all the kind of things. And so maybe you could speak a little bit to, as a builder, what do you do to ensure that all your subcontractors and the various trades and so forth are actually executing on what the design intent was and the materials?
That's a great topic. We actually today came up on a project, and not to the nth detail on the subcontractor side, but we were looking at the specs versus the plans, and they're two different products spec'd out and or specified, and the one in the spec was cost friendly. It met the budget, and then the plans, it was a lot more expensive, and they were the basis. These were outdoor site furnishings, and it was a concrete table versus a metal, sitting table for our community, and did it provide the same aspects and or space for students to learn, break, etc. Yes, but one was extremely more expensive than the other. And so even to that easy, just looking at doing constructability, looking at your specs, looking at your plans, ensuring that the subcontractors or we're pricing out all of that, it just takes that time to go through. And so we will get our pricing from our subs, and then we'll do bid leveling. We'll make sure that everybody is, apples to apples on that, on whatever the project component is. And then if for some reason an item is, a subcontractor is more, and or one is less, we're evaluating that to make sure that we're getting the product and they aren't skimping. And so then it also goes back to when you're actually building it, being out there and the entire team making sure. So from owner's advisor, the client, and the contractor, managing those sub and trade partners to make sure that the the community is again getting their money's worth. And that's just our job. We do it. I mean, it seems again oversimplified, but you've got to be active. You've got to be watching it, making sure that everything you can really build what you priced out. And I think sometimes when you have those cutting corners, it's potentially maybe even the delivery method, right? That can impact it as well. Having a partner in a design build versus a hard bid, those are where you're seeing some sacrifices come through. Sometimes, if you're doing a design bid build, you're getting lowest price as opposed to some of the efforts that Measure HH is putting through on the larger projects with the design build process, really having a collaborative team of designers and builders coming together. And so bringing that value and being able to bring the best components to the team. So that's what we do throughout the process.
Andrea and Jeff, you may be more familiar with this, but it speaks to a lot of Aurora's area and concerns that she has, which is if you can't maintain it or that it's so difficult to get at, then it can turn into a safety issue and health. I think the most famous one of these, there was a case in, I want to say in the Netherlands, or maybe it was Germany, where there had been a pool, a community pool that was built, and they had a hanging ceiling, and they had used a certain type of steel, standard steel J-hook kind of thing, and it was deemed to be the absolute best. The engineers had all done this, and because you had it in a hanging ceiling, it was impossible to get up there and inspect. And then people weren't concerned about it because it had built only like 10 years ago or something, and then it had a catastrophic failure. The whole ceiling collapsed, and it ended up killing a whole lot of, unfortunately, children. And what it turned out was that the relatively moist environment of these pool and the chlorine that was in the atmosphere with it actually ended up penetrating. This was stainless steel J bolts, but there were tiny little cracks that could happen, and the chlorine could get into that and then create micro fissures. And over time, they ended up failing and creating a chain reaction. But it goes to Aurora's often comments saying, yes, in the management consulting world, they say if you can't measure, you can't manage it. in the M&O world, if you can't inspect it, if you can't put eyes on it, and you can't put tools, it ultimately is going to be a failure for safety and or security.
I tell you, every time now I'm thinking about a design decision, I always hear Aurora's voice in the back of my head going, "But could we maintain it?" And it's like the best success yet out of this conversation.
But I mean, to that point that how design, having the greatest ideas intent, but then how is it actually maintained if you can't see it? We had a similar situation of a school. Luckily, the collapse happened when in the summer when kids weren't there. But the entire campus, they had to shut down. They had to move them, and we had to rebuild part of that campus. And it was to the point, Jennifer was talking about just because you get a low bid, there might be a reason. And, are they qualified? Is it a collaborative team like design build can give you a lot of accountability between each other to find the best value for what you need. I think with that, Andrea, as we're talking about this overall process, what are some of the critical first steps when we're pulling together all this habitability and safety issues?
Sure. As as it always starts with San Diego CCD's guidelines and design standards. So, and the fact that they've already done all this pre-work is phenomenal. And so just making sure everyone's familiar with it, but I also think reviewing it for the specific application to each project and then understanding if there are additional goals beyond those, especially when it comes to safety and security or the perception of safety and security, and making sure that everyone is on board with this right balancing act of what are the pros and cons of the different approaches and how can they be weighed, and not just leadership but your stakeholders and your end users, and making sure that they have buy off and kind of signed on to the approach for safety and security and that it will meet their needs going forward, and doing that as early as possible and then keep coming back to everyone because it does come down to not just the big moves but the little moves, and sort of carrying that all the way through the design, all the way through material selection, specification, and to Jennifer's point, making sure then that it's the thing that's getting built in the field. So it's really about a continuous process that's happening from beginning to end.
Well, this is phenomenal. This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate all of our guests. Thank you for everybody being here. And just wanted to thank the listeners for participating here. And wanted to invite you to our next session. We'll be talking student success built by design. We'll be taking a deeper dive into social needs, belonging, connectivity, community. We'll be exploring these some case studies of student space, equity-based design process, and outcomes of impacts on the built environment. Thanks for joining our podcast, Student Success Built by Design. This series is brought to you by the San Diego Community College District and its Measure HH Bond program, whose goal is to further its education and student success mission. We'll see you next time. Measure HH is a $3.5 billion voter-approved capital improvement bond program at the San Diego Community College District, transforming its 10 campuses, which are housed in 4 separate colleges that collectively enroll 90,000 students annually. Measure HH will impact nearly 1 million students in its first 10 years,